I'm Merv Wyeth, and I'm a member of APM Benefits and Value SIG. Benchmarking for improved project performance. It's an important topic. It's got wide application, and our presenter today is Tim Podesta, who I'm going to introduce to you shortly. Benchmarking for improved project performance. Tim will introduce the subject of benchmarking and illustrate with personal and professional examples. He'll describe how considered use of data does three things. It drives continuous improvement, it supports target setting, and it enables sharing and learning across an organization and with outside peers. And Tim's also going to explain how benchmarking can be applied to improving project performance. So what do we know about Tim? Tim is a subject matter expert in project management. He has particular interests in business and investment analysis, front-end planning, benchmarking and assurance. Tim has deep experience of the oil, gas and petrochemical industry and a record of delivering cross-cultural programs in change management and process improvement. And he recently completed 35 years at BP. Tim is a qualified professional Toastmaster. He's also an experienced facilitator and can work in English and French, using this to build multicultural support. So we all know a little bit about you as an audience. So just for those that haven't seen this before, it's based on the Government Project Delivery Capability Framework. And the three areas across the top: leadership, project delivery specialist, and then business analysis and change. So Tim, I think you can see the variety there, but the bulk of people on this call are project delivery specialists.
So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Merv, for your kind introduction. So who on this webinar has a professional goal or business target that they want to achieve? Who listening in today has a personal goal like getting fit or running? Benchmarking can help achieve all of these goals. So I'm going to introduce the subject of benchmarking and illustrate with one personal example and three professional examples. So what is benchmarking? Looking back at history, a benchmark was a surveyor's mark cut in a wall, a pillar or a building, and used as a reference point in measuring altitudes and levels. In today's context, I like to describe benchmarking as a considered use of data as a way of achieving three things. Firstly, driving continuous improvement. Secondly, to support target setting, which is realistic. And thirdly, to foster sharing and learning across an organization and with outside peers. So put simply, benchmarking is achieving important goals by comparing performance with colleagues and peers using data. So to illustrate this, I have one personal and three professional examples. And first of all, my personal example. This comes from my drive for better health and fitness through running. And in the picture here, I'm with my daughter, just having completed the London Winter 10K charity run this February. We ran together and beat our target of going under 1 hour and raised over £1,000 for cancer research. Now, a big part of achieving this goal was based on using the fantastic Park Run. So who's heard of that? And maybe some of you have run it as well. Park Run is a weekly 5-kilometre group run held at hundreds of locations, mainly in the UK, but increasingly so around the world. It starts at 9 AM on every Saturday morning, and it has changed many people's lives. And for me, provides the motivation to participate, to improve my performance, supported by easy accessible data. Now, the data from the Park Run comes from a very clever use of technology and is as simple as registering on the Park Run website. And with registration comes a barcode. And when you finish the Park Run, the timers will scan your code and you get a recorded time with all the others. Now, that's over 170,000 people in the UK each weekend. So for me, the big incentive, as well as running, it allows me to run with family and friends. And you also get a record of performance each time you run and a comparison to your previous performances. A personal best recorded for every different course you run, a comparison to others who run, and very usefully, an age-related percentage performance. This all supports an overall goal of keeping fit and healthy, and having the opportunity to spend time with friends and family in the community, and as a bonus, raise money for charity. So that's my personal example. So before looking at professional examples, let me ask a question. And that question is, what type of projects are you working on? And I'm going to hand back now to Merv, who's going to use the Mentimeter to get your input on this.
Okay, so we're back now. Tim, I think you'll be able to see these come in and start to scroll. So please feel free to comment on them.
There's some personal things around next career opportunities, as well as some interesting diversity certainly from the government scope, change management, engineering. I mean, my most significant experience comes from my time as a subject matter expert for project best practices and benchmarking, where I was responsible for promoting benchmarking to support the drive for improved project performance across the BP group in a number of areas. I can see some of these appearing in here, like upstream, midstream pipelines and shipping, downstream refining petrochemicals, and even alternative energy, solar and wind and IT transformation. And I can see the range of projects we're working on here also cover what I describe as processes around system integration and revenue growth. So thank you so much for your input. So to complete my summary of the project you've worked on and my own personal experience, I was also working for BP, the owner of the group guide for benchmarking, which supported BP's operating management system. And one of the mandatory essentials within that system was to benchmark good operating practices across the group to identify opportunities for risk reduction and operating performance improvement. So benchmarking was seen as a tool to support good operating. So my three professional examples come firstly from my time as subject matter expert, where I was leading the benchmarking of best practices across the BP group. The second one, I look at a particular area where I was involved with specific project benchmarking, that's oil and gas pipelines. And thirdly, my most recent experience was acting as a critical friend in reviewing the benchmarking for best practice guide issued by the Cabinet Office, the Infrastructure and Project Authority, the IPA. So for my first professional example, I have three complementary benchmarks that I want to share with you, and they are front-end planning, team alignment, and project complexity. The first one I'm showing you here is something called the Project Definition Rating Index, or PDRI. It's a tool developed by the North American Construction Industry Institute, the CII, and it's intended to benchmark the quality of front-end planning. Now, this was an area of research I was deeply involved in as a company representative and a co-leader of the industry working group. Now, the chart you're looking at now shows the progression of front-end plans from left to right through the early project stages. And the level of progression is measured by a finely tuned checklist of over 70 elements weighted by importance, covering basis of project decision, project design, and execution approach. And a lower score is better. And the chart shows a range of scores against outcomes over time, improving. And these have been determined by research based on a very large number of completed projects, a large sample size. And then research has shown that proper front-end planning, as measured by PDRI, leads to much more predictable cost and schedule outcomes. So that's a front-end planning benchmark. The next one I want to share is team alignment, team functionality. The tool shown here was also developed by the CII, and the chart shows a tool called the Team Alignment Thermometer. Now, there are four main dimensions that are measured by a team member questionnaire. The results are then collated and discussed in a team workshop. Now, the four dimensions are culture, leadership, communication, and behaviors, project execution processes, information on clear project priorities and objectives, and fourthly, team working processes and behaviors. Now, the exercise of measuring the alignment in the actual workshop greatly aids team development by identifying gaps and fostering an environment of openness and collaboration. So that's the second practice measurement tool. And the third one is quite nicely described as the house of project complexity. And this is a measure of project complexity developed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, MIT. And I was involved with its testing on a portfolio of international and BP projects. Now, within here, there are three main dimensions. There is a technical dimension, which is really revolves around the technological challenge of the project. The institutional dimension, which is the context for the project, things like regulation and stakeholders. And thirdly, quite often forgotten, is the architectural dimension of complexity, how the project is set up in terms of governance, team working, locations, and so on, and contract structure. Now, this can add significantly to complexity, particularly where you may have distributed teams and complicated governance. So three measures of complexity, or three measures of best practice, and front-end planning, team alignment, and complexity, I believe, are the most useful ones and the ones I've come across with most utility. And they've been proven by the CII and others to significantly impact project performance when you look at the variety of measures. And that performance in terms of cost, schedule, and outcomes. Now, as an example of this, I'd like to share with you a notable insight that came from looking at the data from some completed projects, a sample size of nearly 20. And when we looked at the combination of these benchmarking metrics, there was one particular insight which really struck me and is a useful one to share with you. This is a simplified chart showing the outcome. As I say, this was based on a relatively small sample size of 20 projects, but sufficient to allow us to look at trends. And it shows the linkage between, on the y-axis, the schedule slippage of a project from low to high, and on the x-axis, the combination, that's the function of combining team alignment and complexity. So what we see here is the greater the project complexity combined with lesser team alignment, the more likely you're going to have schedule slippage. And the analysis showed from the data we had a relatively strong trend. Now, what we show here is an R-squared, the statistical R-squared correlation, which is the closeness of the data point to the trend line, where 1 would be perfect. And the trend showed here is, I would describe that as is certainly significant as a trend. Now, conversely, when you look at this chart, what you can also say is that you can schedule slippage will be less when you have less complex projects, and most importantly, is reduced by having greater team alignment and functionality. So I thought that would be a useful, just an insight from the analysis that I've been involved with into best practices. And certainly the front-end planning best practices shown time and time again to link to more predictable schedule and cost outcomes, and actually other outcomes as well, like safety and operating. So that completes my tour of project best practices and the complementary measures around front-end planning, team alignment, complexity. I'd like to now move on to my second professional example, which relates to benchmarking for major oil and gas pipelines. Now, specifically pipelines from Azerbaijan to Europe. And I was involved in facilitating a series of front-end planning workshops, also advising on project best practices and investment analysis in support of the finance memorandum being presented for the final investment decision on a number of the projects. My own personal story is one of facilitating these front-end planning workshops. And I think it's a great example of how the actual benchmarking process can make a huge difference to project outcomes. Combination of providing some measures, but also some opportunities for team alignment as well. Now, in this case, I was leading a workshop in the main project team offices in Paddington in London, and the key representatives of the team were present: project manager, project services manager, lead engineers, most importantly, operations representative, and the environmental and safety leads. Now, we were in a meeting room overlooking Paddington Station, and I can remember now the atmosphere being very tense but positive. And we were assessing the readiness of the project and also looking for gaps. My role as facilitator was to both listen and lead, and particularly listen for the quietest voice. And there were several moments when I probed for more information and asked for the question of tell me more about particular aspects of the project as we went through the checklist. And we did identify some critical items that needed more attention to reduce the risk of delays. Now, I'm happy to say the project moved smoothly into detailed design and is effectively in operation today. And the subject of front-end planning is one that I have significantly more to say on, and that's probably subject for our presentation on a different day on the value from front-end planning. Now, this result that I've described to you, the front-end planning workshop, that became part of the benchmarking supplement for the financial case. And it was used to support the financial case for the investment in the pipeline. Now, the actual supplement, I think, is a good example of best practice, and it included effectively some very powerful images in support of the benchmarks. And the first one is back to the project definition rating index. Now, this was actually showed the results of the workshops I described earlier, and it actually shows the benchmarking for the portfolio projects as they move through the various project stages. And this was a portfolio of oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey. And when you look to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see the point at which the project was using this benchmark to support the finance submission. And the actual text used to support it went as follows: the overall score of 240 over 1,000, where lower score is better, indicates the project is well positioned for entering the execute stage. The score is within the range for projects approaching financial sanction. So this is one of the charts which was on the benchmarking supplement. Effectively, the purpose of the one page was to inform the decision maker and to explain the benchmarking results in support of the financial case. So two more charts I'm going to show you from that same document by way of example. And the second one shows a schedule outcome. Now, not showing all the data on here, but just to show the actual shape of the image. And this shows a benchmark of meters per spread day. Now, in pipeline terms, the spread is the equipment and team which effectively installs the pipeline. So that's we're talking about a pipeline spread. And as it says on the chart, it's from the start of welding the pieces of pipe together to actually burying, putting the backfill back on top. But what the chart shows is in yellow, the company references, and in green, it shows the benchmarks for the actual project question. Now, the comparative benchmarks in yellow are based on reference points, and these are all being justified and assessed on the basis they are comparable to the project in question, and have been validated as being useful for comparison by the PMO and the central team. So there is an assurance aspect of this as well. And the comment in the finance submission to go with the chart was that the pipeline has a low meters per day lay rate because of the terrain, the brownfield working, and numerous work locations. Brownfield being the fact that the pipeline is being laid near to existing pipelines, so that provided some constraint. So that's an example of the schedule benchmark, and the next one is cost. And this shows an industry standard metric for pipelines, which is cost per diameter inch kilometer. And the key thing is, you can see on the chart, once again, the green cost for the pipeline in question and two reference pipelines in yellow. And once again, there was a justification for the actual image and the benchmark being shown. And the cost is higher to the references due to more complex work scope, brownfield working again, and the fact that the work sequence wasn't continuous and there were terrain challenges. So 3 charts I've shown you in support of a financial case straight from benchmarking, showing different aspects to benchmarking. So I haven't shown you my pipeline example and some best practices that I'm very passionate about. Let me ask a question. And that question is, what is your experience of benchmarking?
Okay, Tim. So I'm now already displaying the results. We put the question in there just a few moments ago, so some people have started entering their data. Tim, and you can see the results starting to come in on those 6 areas. So do please talk to them as they come in.
Indeed, and it's interesting in the order. It's almost like a waterfall going down. And cost and schedule are, certainly in my experience, the most common ones. It's good to see outcomes there as well. And it's nice to see some reference to benchmarking of best practices. I think it's an area that's less common, but it's good to see some examples there. So thank you for that. It looks like we've got, so we're approaching the 100 as you asked for.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can imagine you'll be writing a paper about this, Tim, afterwards, and you know, some really good data coming in here. One of the other things to mention is that you will then do some Q&A, so people to send their questions in as we go. So, but if I hand back to you then, Tim, and you can carry on.
So we now move on to my 3rd and final professional example, which is actually the most current one. And I'm looking here at a document, Best Practice in Benchmarking. Now, this was a guide issued in March of this year by the Infrastructure Projects Authority, the IPA. And I was privileged to have the opportunity to provide some input before its publishing. And I was acknowledged, or have been acknowledged, as a critical reviewer of the document. Now, what the document does, and there's a link there so you can look at it, it's available on gov.uk. It describes benchmarking as the process of improving costs and performance against similar projects. Now, certainly the examples I've given you before, that you can see that it's in line with that as an intent. And the actual document itself talks about the benefits of benchmarking by project stage. And I've extracted from the document some points which I think are worth noting. So 3 things, 3 key project stages that the IPA document state that benchmarking is useful in supporting. First one is during policy creation to select the right project. During detailed delivery conversations, providing challenge and confidence. And at the end of the project to assess performance, share learning, and build continuous improvement into the system. And what I've done there is highlighted the C's, the sort of 5 C's there. And in summary, for those 5 C's, the policy creation, the conversations, the challenge, the confidence, and the continuous improvement, for me, they cover the range of benefits that the benchmarking process provides. So that's a nice set of C's to have in mind when you're looking at benchmarking. Now, core of the document is the benchmarking process, and it has 7 steps. Now, to help myself describe those steps, and hopefully it's helpful for yourselves as well, I've on this chart I've shown effectively a mnemonic to help, and I'll go to that in a minute. But this process is particularly designed for major infrastructure projects, for rail and road, and I'll show you with you a couple of examples in a minute. But I would argue that it could be applied to many other types of projects as well, you know, particularly in the private and the public context. So there are 7 steps, and my mnemonic here is an acronym with Octavia. Now, Octavia is a Latin name, and it actually means 8th born baby. But there are only 7 steps here. But certainly Octavia is a nice way of keeping it in mind. So going through them one by one. The first step, objectives. This is all around confirming the project objectives and setting the metrics. And for me, that's getting clarity on the basis for the benchmarking. It's very important. Step 2, components. This is breaking the project into major components for benchmarking. And this is where you need to choose the benchmarks wisely. Things that you can compare and things that you can usefully, effectively communicate to peers and also to leaders. Step 3, template. So you develop the templates for data gathering. And the key thing here is you're creating a common language and forum for the expertise. You need a forum to be able to have a conversation around the data. Step 4 is the acquisition. Develop, this is scope, sources, and gathering the data. And the critical success factor is the acquisition of data. Step 5 is validate. So with the data, it really needs to be properly validated and rebased if necessary. And within this, a critical success factor is the quality of the data, ensuring that it's comparable and there's confidence in its where it comes from. Step 6, I've described this as image, and this is around producing and testing the benchmark figure and presenting it. Take you back to my pipeline example. It's the image and how things are presented that can be very helpful in the visual presentation of the benchmark. And finally, part of the loop is the assess. So review and repeat before using the data for benchmarking, assessing its impact and making it available for others to use as well. So in support of this process, these 7 steps, the IPF have created a benchmarking team, and it supports their Transforming Infrastructure Performance program, that's commonly known as a TIP program. And the benchmarking guide is also aligned to something called TIES, the Transport Infrastructure Efficiency Strategy, which is an activity sponsored by the Department for Transport, DFT. It also involves Transport for London, TfL, Traffic England, High Speed 2, Network Rail, and Crossrail. And members of TIES have already worked together to produce a benchmarking for tunnelling, which is an example I'm going to share with you in a minute. And they're looking at other areas and certainly to align to this best practice guide and use it as part of their process. So I mentioned tunnelling. And this is also from a gov.uk document, which is available. I'm going to show you 2 charts. The first one is a chart showing benchmarks for cost. And it was produced by the benchmarking team, the IPA, in support of a forum representing a number of organisations: Crossrail, High Speed 2, Heathrow, Network Rail, Transport for London, Highways England, Thames Tideway Tunnel, National Grid, and Scottish Water. So a very diverse group. And the study was based on tunnelling data across a range of infrastructure types. You can see here there was a distinction made between transport and utilities. And there were 25 major tunnelling projects identified, recently completed in the UK. And the good news is that there were valid data points collected for a substantial number of those, for 16 of them. Now, what the chart shows here on the y-axis is a standard cost per unit face area against tunnel length. So you've got the meter cubed, which is to do with the face area of the tunnel. And like the pipeline example I shared earlier, where the standardized metric was based on a diameter, this is based on an area, which is an interesting comparison. Now, the chart shows the data separated distinctly into utility and transport tunnels. Now, the transport tunnels were in the range of 5.5 to 11.5 meters diameter, but most of them would be between 6.8 and 8.1. This is detail that you'll find in the actual report if you want to delve into it a bit more. Whilst utility tunnels tend to be smaller, in the range of 2 to 8.8 meters, where most of them were between 3.4 and 5.2 meters. Now, the principal drivers of cost across both groups, perhaps unsurprisingly, are length and diameter. And what this chart does, I think, is two things. It shows a trend, which is useful to benchmark against, but also can help identify specific projects to benchmark against. And then the other chart is related to tunneling performance, and effectively it's a schedule metric. It's the production rate, meters per week. And once again, you can see here a distinction between the utility and the transport. I think it's less clear, the trend here, but once again, it does give you the opportunity to identify specific projects to benchmark against. So that's my summary related to the work done by IIP, and it's ongoing this year, and the work of TIEs. There is one additional piece of guidance I'd like to share around benchmarking, and that's the distinction between internal and external benchmarking. And I describe this as the yin and yang blending of internal and external benchmarking. Now, for me, ideally, these interact for maximum benefit. You can connect internal and external benchmarks as part of the overall utility of using benchmarking. And internal benchmarking, certainly you would expect to be able to do that within an organization, but certainly within let's say an umbrella organization like a major company or across government. External benchmarking is normally with organizations outside your own. It is harder to do external benchmarking because you normally need, I would say, three things in addition to the internal benchmarking. There's a legal consideration around non-disclosure agreements, having an NDA for any data that's shared. There's a legal consideration around intellectual property, the IP. So that needs to be considered in doing an external benchmarking. And thirdly, you also requires trust in the sharing of information in order to get maximum benefit. So those are the three things. And that aspect of trust can also be significant within an organization, particularly if you've got potentially a number of internal silos. My own personal experience working in an oil company, we had silos in terms of the different activity in upstream, downstream, petrochemicals, and alternative energy. And in doing the benchmarking across the whole organization, there were certainly boundaries to deal with, and particularly around two things: the creation of trust in the sharing of data, but also there being different approaches potentially. Might be industry driven, might be due to history of the organization. But what I found was that benchmarking, when worked out across the big organization, certainly facilitated sharing and learning. And what I've observed is that there is a similar situation across government, particularly around the scope of the IPA work, which I've just described. But having a shared benchmarking mindset, it should be possible to overcome differences across government agencies like TfL, Traffic England, High Speed 2 Network Rail, and Crossrail, all of those involved in the TIEs effort, which I think has great potential. So that's the yin and yang of benchmarking, which I think is an important thing to consider. So to conclude, I've attempted to explain benchmarking. I've used one personal example, park running, three professional examples, the best practices, pipelines, and the IPA document, and to show that benchmarking, as described here, is the use of data to facilitate continuous improvement, support realistic target setting, and create a learning culture. Now, I believe passionately that using a benchmark gives an invaluable external perspective. It can remove tunnel vision and prevent groupthink. And as a measure, benchmark provides a discussion point a reasonable target, and should provide a fair comparison for a project. So my call for action is that we should look to use data and benchmark to help us achieve our professional and our personal goals. I look forward to your continuing input on the Q&A side of things, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'll hand to Merv, who is going to be Master of Ceremonies for that part of the session today. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. Some really interesting information that's coming in. Tim, you'll be able to look through this. We are very keen, particularly in our SIG, on reflective practice. And so what we're looking to do is to understand what you've learned or will do differently as a result of attending this webinar. So, and the do differently is important, because I think the value from these things really comes from changes in behavior, etc. So thank you for that information that's going to come in. We're going to leave that in the background, and we can then do some further analysis on it afterwards. Questions coming in. There are a few there. I'm going to kick it off with a question of my own. So let's just move on. As I say, keep putting the reflective practice information in there. So Tim, what area of benchmarking is most developed in your experience?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. And I'm reminded of the data we gathered earlier on this webinar, where certainly the use of benchmarking for cost, and maybe not so much, but not far behind for schedule, that's probably most developed. And it's certainly in the area of best practices, although it wasn't reflected in that data, front-end planning. There are a number of, as well as the PDRI tool I mentioned, there are a number of other approaches to assessing front-end planning, front-end loading, FEL, something I've come across in the industry. So that's probably the other area that's most developed, but there's certainly scope for more, and also using it well.
Okay, great. And then from our audience, this one's from Andrew. What benchmarks have you used to measure value?
Right, so that's a good question. I would say it depends on what's creating the value. The one that comes to mind is certainly you want to be able to benchmark operating performance. And I can see, and the two things come to mind there. One, in a, say, production environment, you're looking to benchmark and measure the actual production from an asset, maybe compare that to what was projected. And another thing that comes to mind is around benefits. And you may have benefits around more productivity of a particular process, less downtime if you're trying to reduce waste. So those are the ones that come to mind. That's a good question, because value is another thing I'm passionate about.
I think that might segue quite nicely into this question from Ryan, which is, where can I find some IT benchmarks?
Right, yeah, during my time with BP, I spent a number of years working as commercial manager in the IT function. And well, I think there's two places you can get benchmarks from, I think. There's the obvious one, you compare to other projects you may have in the system. And then the company which we did use a few times to help with suggesting of metrics and also getting data was Gartner. So there are a number of organizations out there who who are industry known, who can provide potentially some sort of free data sources, but then you then have to consider whether you want their professional help on top of that. So that would be my suggestions for IT. If there's anything more specific on that, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I think you covered some of this within your presentation, but what would you say were the main barriers to carrying out benchmarking?
Well, I think the two obvious ones come to mind, probably data and trust. And when I say data, it's the having the information you want, but also having in the right, the right metric. And then trust is being able to access the data and have the conversation, because it's quite often it's the conversation you have around the data and applying the data that can provide the insight and the learning.
Yes, and presumably a lot of the data might be considered to be sensitive in some way, particularly perhaps commercially sensitive, I suppose, within the private sector.
Yes, and then it has to be taken into account with, particularly if you're sharing externally, the arrangements for doing that, and which might take a bit of time to set up, but once, the example I can think of is something called performance forum, when you've got forums like that which allow you to have an established relationship for sharing. They can be very powerful.
Okay, so the questions are coming in thick and fast. This was a really interesting one. So it's from Shah. As an ex-pipeline designer, I'm particularly keen to understand if there are any cultural barriers in benchmarking for that project.
Cultural barriers, I think probably no different to the ones you'd have in doing business. Obviously, in creating an environment of trust, you have to do it in a certain way for different working in different cultures, and you particularly if you want to be both open about the actual result, even you're sharing the data from, but also being open to sort of talking about it and some of the reasons behind a particular result. So I think it's a good question. There may be it's certainly more difficult in when you've got sort of cultural differences, as it were.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, there's a couple of questions relate to tools. Excuse me, I've got a barking dog in the background. But so I guess what would your recommendation be on specific tools that support benchmarking?
Okay, so I guess two things occurring to me. One is one of the tools would be what sources you might use, and depending on what you're looking to benchmark, one of the tricks we might be finding doing some research into what the appropriate sources might mean, maybe getting advice from peers. And then the other one is maybe as simple as doing a PowerPoint chart. But also,
Okay.
you may, if you're doing statistical analysis, I mean the chart I showed you using some simple regression, maybe some statistical tools, and Excel can do this sort of stuff, and so some simple statistical tools as well can be helpful in identifying trends if you want to go that next step of looking at portfolio data.
Okay, and here's a really good question, I think, from Ashok, which is what do you do when you're asked to benchmark a project that is completely unique in nature? And he uses the example of R&D work, so something that is new to the industry.
Right. Well, two thoughts occur to this. One is think laterally. What aspect of the project could you benchmark? I mean, R&D, you may find some aspect of the actual project or development which could be compared. And the other one is actually the process. You may be doing an R&D development of a particular discovery or new technology or new product, but there will be certainly plenty of other new technologies and products which have been brought to market, and you might want to look at benchmarks around how long those things take, what sort of processes they go through, and how much they might cost. So that would be my suggestion in that case.
Thank you for that. There's a few more questions, but we're ripping through them, so that's brilliant, Tim. I'd always expect Agile to come up in these conversations. So how easy do you think it is to carry out benchmarking in Agile projects?
It should be, if you look at the overall delivery of an Agile project, you should be able to benchmark it in the same way as a traditional project, because you will have certainly some parameters which you can compare in terms of the overall outcome. What's probably more difficult is the pace of running your sprints and having your sort of delivery items coming up throughout the project. The difficulty may be in having time to actually benchmark particular elements. But if you can do that in the context of the bigger picture, I think it's definitely something that should be possible.
Okay, and perhaps finally on the questions, are sustainability criteria considered in benchmarking activity?
They should be. I put them under the umbrella of outcomes, which I think is much less developed area in terms of benchmarks, although it's probably one of the most important to have useful benchmarks to help with target setting at the start of projects. Yes, so I think to answer your question,
Okay.
yes, they should find a place depending on the importance of important objectives of a project, going back to the IPA model.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic, and I'm displaying the different types of benchmarking here, and there were about a third of people who responded at experience of outcomes and benefits. So
yep.
That's really specifically interesting, I think, to the context of the webinar by the benefits and values SIG. Perhaps as we move to an end, you can see in terms of reflective practice, fantastic feedback from our audience. So we will spend time going through that and any additional questions. We've got a couple that perhaps you can pick up, Tim, offline. There's your contact details. You'd very much like people to contact you either via LinkedIn, good old QR code. So that's what Tim looks like as a code, and that's a picture of Tim probably at his Toastmasters, and there's your email address there, Tim. So I anticipate you'll have lots of calls. So, and just before we finish up, what I wanted to do was to explain the second handout that I'd uploaded that I think you'll find really useful. So it is a list of all the webinars that that we've done in our webinar series that started in November 2017. And what that list allows you to do is to click on the link. So if I go to the PDF version, what you'll see is you can hover over and click into the links, which is a full write-up. It's the recording, it's the slides, etc. And then you've got the Mentimeter results. So you know, the last one that you may have joined us for with Ken Dolan, click in there to see the write-up, and then click in here to see the results. And on that one, we had something like 170 plus items in terms of the reflective practice. So Ken set the bar very high last time, but I think you've kind of you're more or less there. Interesting. We perhaps should benchmark our speakers, but I'm not quite sure what criteria we would use on that. I'm sure you'd have some suggestions, Tim.
Oh yes, there are the standard ones around which come through in the feedback. It's always useful to get the feedback, and we can use that to help us improve.
Okay, so with that in mind, contact details now displayed. We're about 4 minutes out from the hour, so it's been fantastic. So thanks ever so much, Tim. Thank you to the audience. Yes,
and my thanks as well. The reflective practice comments are very, very helpful, and certainly I encourage you to think on benchmarking as how it can help you personally and professionally. And particularly, there was a couple of comments, I think, around the PDRI and the CII work. I have particular interest in those, so if those who are interested in that or want some more specific information, please get in touch.
Yes, yeah, that was both in the reflective practice, but there are also a couple of questions that come in specifically from William and Lorena, and maybe if you could pick those up and they contact you, then you'll can deal with some specifics. But thanks very much for that, and okay, and thank you one and all, and goodbye.